And we're live. Welcome everybody to Lockdown Learning Live. My name is Lee. I'm a certified flight instructor at Sling Pilot Academy. It's shown somewhere up here. Sling Pilot Academy does flight instruction all the way from private pilots up to CFIs and even MEIs, multi-engine instructors, and that they're training for people who are going to the airlines. So today, we're talking about the third type of drag. A lot of people don't think this drag is as important to learn about, but if you're somebody that's planning on going into the airlines, then this is definitely a drag that you'll have to be familiar with, because airliners have to deal with wave drag. So the first two that we talked about were parasite drag and then induced drag, and today we're going to talk about wave drag. So let's get rolling. Okay, so to understand wave drag, we have to understand kind of how sound works, okay? So I pulled down my guitar here, and we're going to talk a little bit about how sound works. And one of the easiest ways to see sound waves is actually to look at what happens when I pluck different guitar strings. And of course I can pluck a bunch of guitar strings and play terribly because I'm not very good at guitar, but it's easier to see if we zoom in. So let's check this out real quick. So as you could see in that video there, the strings that he was plucking all sorts of different strings. When he was plucking those strings, they were actually turning into a little wave. So first we're going to talk about longitudinal and transverse waves. Now, technically, the wave that's created by the string that he's plucking is a standing wave, but it can be kind of compared to a transverse wave. Now, sound waves, essentially what's happening is that movement of the string, the vibration, is disrupting the air, and then that's moving into your eardrum, and your eardrum vibrates too, and then that kind of does the opposite direction of it. So it kind of takes that movement and then it converts it into signals that go through our brain and such. So let's look at longitudinal versus transverse waves here. Sorry about that. So here's the long versus the trans. That's really what you have to worry about. And I put a little A here. This is how I remember along the wave, right? So a longitudinal wave, the wave is propagating along the wave. Transverse wave is across the wave, up and down, kind of like this string that I drew some guy, you know, waving the string. Basically, the wave is up and down, kind of like what you were seeing in the guitar. So when we think about sound waves, the actual sound that's coming off, most of the time we're talking about longitudinal waves. And if you take a look here, basically what happens is the bunched up waves that got disrupted propagate longitudinally down the line, and then they come and they hit you and you hear the sound, and you either are very disturbed or you're happy, depending on what you're listening to. So also when these waves hit you, they get disrupted as well. And to kind of show you this propagation, I've got another video here of some slinkies. Slinkies are a good example of So yeah, nice dramatic music for our Slinky movie. Yeah, so basically, if you guys saw the Slinky, it had that like crunched up portion that moved down, and as it moved down, that's essentially what's happening with these waves. Obviously, on the opposite end, the thing that's already passed through, it's normalized, but basically this crunched up portion travels through the medium, in our case, air, and then that's how sound essentially propagates. So we have these two different types. And the reason that I introduced the two types is we don't want to have a confusion of what's happening here. A lot of people think of waves as like waves in the ocean, where they're like popping up and curling over, and then they're like kind of propagating sideways that way, where the wave kind of is standing and coming across. That's not the type of wave we're talking about when we're talking about sound waves. Sound waves are more of the slinky type, where we're seeing the crunched upness of the whatever's traveling go across, right? So that's what we're seeing here at the top with our longitudinal wave. So longitudinal waves, if we come down and we start talking about wave bunching, which is our next topic, we're going to come down and talk about how these waves kind of bunch up. So if we come down here to a little representation, we have these kind of molecules traveling, right? So we have molecules traveling across, and the blue ones, I like to call these like free waves because they're not being disrupted. And then as they come across, they hit something, and then that's basically the compressed wave. So as you can see, as the wave hits the object, it basically bunches up, compresses itself, and then it actually communicates backwards. And that sounds a little bit weird, but physically that's what's happening. The molecules communicate backwards this direction, and then the waves happening before it this direction, the waves happening before it have to change. They have to make an adjustment. And we'll see in a little bit what happens if we don't make the adjustment, right? So our waves are getting bunched up, and we can move on and kind of look at this as more of what people like to think of like a sound, this curved thing, kind of like a echolocation from a bat or something when you visualize it. So we have this thing coming, and then it's communicating back. Okay, we're back. All right. So, oh man, it got all wonky. Okay, bear with me here because things are getting weird. Just like we're going to get super weird with our waves. Okay, so just to recap, if you guys missed part of that, as our airflow comes around our airfoil, it speeds up over the top surface here. It gets faster, right? So what happens when we go so fast that we're nearing supersonic speeds, right? This is essentially what's going to happen to us. We're nearing Mach 1, and real quick, let's dive into a little bit of what Mach means. And you guys have heard Mach if you're interested in aviation. A Mach number, our Mach number, is very simply your speed, my speed, divided by the speed of sound. So it's a very simple equation, all right? And if your Mach number is greater than 1, then you're supersonic, you're past sonic. If your Mach number is less than 1, then you're subsonic. You're less than sonic speed, okay? So that's what we talk about. That's what we mean when we're saying Mach 1. It's kind of where it transitions from subsonic to supersonic, all right? So as you can see here, we have some relative wind coming in, and we're close to Mach 1. So we're like an airliner maybe, where it's going very fast, but it's not actually going supersonic. Something like an F-22 is something that would be going supersonic, and then that's a whole different ballgame. Right now, we're talking about subsonic travel. Now, what happens when we're traveling close to the speed of sound and we speed up the flow, we actually create supersonic flow on top of our airfoil. And when we create supersonic flow on top of the airfoil, then we have disruptions in the flow after the supersonic flow, essentially. And that's what wave drag is right there. And that's why I drew it kind of as a wave afterwards. Now, what's actually happening here? Like, what's actually creating this disturbance? Well, if we come down and we look at this kind of crummy depiction of my airfoil. So there's the airfoil in black. And then I have essentially, this is supersonic speed. Like this actual body is traveling at a supersonic speed. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what actually happens here. We talked about before the molecules actually communicating backwards when they get bunched up or compressed, right? And I'll come back up for a second because this is an important understanding. They're getting compressed here when they're hitting the blunt body. Now, real quick, we're not talking about, we're actually talking about sound at this point, right? So just kind of bring yourself into a new space here. So these waves are hitting the body and then they're getting compressed. And now you have a compressed wave, right? Again, these are longitudinal waves, not transverse waves. So they're propagating across and then they're getting compressed, just like what we saw with my little crappy circles. So we can think about this in terms of how cars drive, all right? So on the top here, I have some cars driving in blue. And one of the cars encounters a stop sign, right? And he stops. Now, it's pretty clear to see that that car behind him in blue is going to have plenty of time to stop. That's still going to be a compression, right? But they have communicated that they need to be compressed. And that's, I mean, it sounds crazy, but that's what the wave is doing. It's understanding what's going on around it and then adjusting for the other wave. At the bottom in red, this is what happens if you go too fast. The waves are unable to communicate and you have a collision. And that collision is actually what the sonic, the sonic boom, you can think about it as when you hear it, because it's hard to see it. You can see a cone coming off of it, actually, if you watch a video, and you guys can dive into all sorts of videos. I didn't want to get into the videos because if you're interested, you'll watch F-22s and all sorts of other videos. But conceptually, this is what's happening, is those bunches are happening so quickly that they can't do it anymore and they crash into each other. And they actually create this kind of blunt body problem in front. And I say blunt body because there's also pointed body, which is what we're talking about with F-22s and such. And that's a whole different ballgame. And I might get into that in a little bit if we have time. But right now, let's just talk about blunt bodies and kind of what's happening here. So after that collision occurs, we have a problem. We have that sonic area, which creates disruption. Okay? So why is this a problem? Well, if we ever have, and here's my little happy airplane. We'll talk about him in a second. When we have disruption in our flow, then we don't create as much lift anymore. We're creating a lot of extra drag. We talked about drag before, and we want to reduce the amount of drag we have. So this is an extra form of drag that we have to deal with because the flow is not stable. We'll talk about the difference between laminar and separated flow in a different video. We're going to do that next week, actually. But for now, we're just going to think about this as disrupted flow. This is the problem. Okay, so we have disrupted flow because we're going past our safe speed, essentially, at less than Mach 1. So in a happy airplane like this one, we're going to talk about the difference between small and big airplanes. So big airplanes are the ones that are actually encountering this. Small single engine airplanes don't get fast enough to deal with this. So why is there a construction difference between these two airplanes? Well, because one has to go faster and they have to deal with this form of drag. In small airplanes, we don't really deal with this form of drag. So the design of the airplane shows that. So here's the design of a single engine airplane. It's just got these wings that are essentially perpendicular to the flow. And you can see my blue arrow showing the flow across the wing, right? So what's happening along our wing, this is the drawing of a wing. You can see I've drawn cross sections of the wing, which are in that airfoil shape, and then the blue lines of the air coming over it. The reason I show this is we need something to compare to, because most of us are dealing with single engine airplanes, and that's the easiest way to understand them. So this blue line is just perpendicular flow coming and crossing over the wing. Now, when we move into something more complex, a bigger airplane, here's a big giant airplane, right? Here's our bigger airplane, and we have what's called swept back wings, all right? So we actually have wings that sweep backwards. And the reason that we need these wings to sweep backwards is because of wave drag. All right, so what's actually happening here is we have a relative wind that's coming from our direction of travel. We talked about relative wind. Essentially, it's just the wind that's created from us moving through the air. It's that simple. So we have a relative wind that's being created directly opposite of our travel. Now, what I've drawn here is some other depiction of some flow, right? So the flow that gets accelerated, and I say accelerated because whenever we have flow that comes over the airfoil, it speeds up, right? It accelerates over the airfoil. So if we have flow that accelerates over the airfoil, it's only going to do that along the curvature, right? So let's make this very, very basic. Curvature of this airfoil right here is actually not straight on this wing. It's diagonal to the flow, right? And that's intentional. It's intentionally diagonal to the flow because, as you can see, knowing vectors, knowing vector math, that this perpendicular or this along our travel, this relative wind vector is bigger than the accelerated flow vector, which means that the speed of the flow going across the curved section is actually less than the speed of the wind coming along the direction of travel. So our relative wind is not actually as fast as the flow we care about, right? That's essentially what's happening here. So if we look down and take a look at these cross sections, you might be able to see this more clearly. We have the direction of flow as in black here, and then we have the actual flow that's going over the curvature in blue, and that's actually slower flow. So it's not going as fast, and because of that, we can keep the flow subsonic as it comes over and not have the problem of wave drag. So regardless, of course, there's a limitation to this, and that's what determines how swept your wing is. There are positives and negatives to having a swept wing. Of course, you lose some lift because you're losing some acceleration of flow, and that's a problem at low airspeed, right? Because if we have low airspeed, we want extra lift, but when we're too fast, we don't want it to be creating too much drag. And that's the play that airliners have to deal with here, is how do we keep the airplane safe at slow speed, but also how do we maximize how fast we can go without creating wave drag. And that's the basics of wave drag. Since we have extra time, we'll talk about a little bit different of an object. And to do that, I'm going to have to draw on the fly. So bear with me. Here we go. So as you can see up top, this is a blunt body, right? So blunt body's having this issue with going too fast, and it's creating some sort of interference along a curvature. Now, scientifically, this is kind of crazy, but the actual curvature is intentionally drawn off this body. Like that's where it's created. And that's a whole different science that we're not going to talk about because that's craziness. So what happens if we have a pointed object, right? So here's our pointed object below as comparison. Well, what actually happens to our shock wave is there's not as much compression problem down in the point, right? I've drawn a little bit of a pointed compression issue like before where I was drawing those molecules bunching up. That's what's happening here. A bunching up's creating the problem. So up here, we have a big bunching up problem because there's a lot of body to deal with it, right? So there's a lot of body, so it creates this kind of wave. If we have a pointed body, it's a little bit different. It actually deflects the wave, which sounds a little crazy, but this is what happens in like the F-22 and some of the faster military jets is the flow actually gets deflected, right? And we see something more along the lines of this kind of wave, right? Where we have the wave coming in and then now it's deflected off the body instead of creating a circular, like rounder wave. So there's an interface here, of course. At a certain point, if your triangular body gets too wide, like so, then you still create a rounded shock wave. It still creates a cone that you don't want. So there is kind of limits to this, as there are limits to everything. You can't just have this big fat pointed thing and it not create the problem, is all I'm really trying to say. So the reason that I bring this up is most aircraft that are dealing with this kind of wave problem have a pointed nose, right? If you think about an airliner, it does have more of a pointed nose than like a smaller airplane, but it's still rounded. So when we're dealing with like F-22, for example, then it's got a pointed nose. And forgive my drawing because I'm doing this on the fly. Here's the cockpit, and there's somebody in here, and he's happy, right? Because he's not dealing with supersonic flow. And here are his wings, and they're really swept back. All right. So this is supposed to be a tail. Oh, you guys can't see that. All right, here you go. So here we are with our F-22 poorly drawn. And I swear he's happy. But he's in the military, so he has to pretend he's mad. Okay, so here we go. Basically, what we have to avoid here is when the aircraft is actually going supersonic, like it's actually going super fast and creating the wave off the body, not off the speeding up of flow, then we're creating a wave that looks like this off the tip of the airplane, right? And the reason these wings are swept back is they don't want to be on the wrong side of the cone, okay? So that's the difference here. The accelerated flow wave drag created by a wing is a little bit different than the design of like an F-22, where they're caring more about keeping the airplane out of that cone problem. So that's my unprepared explanation of the sonic wave with a pointed body instead of a blunt body. Again, what we deal with is blunt body objects because most of us are going to end up flying in the airlines, not flying in F-22. And we're going to have to care about the accelerated flow creating the supersonic problem, not the actual body creating the supersonic problem, because airliners just don't fly that fast. And it's that simple. So next time we're gonna roll into kind of into the weeds of the science behind this stuff. Today we talked about longitudinal versus transverse waves. The bunching is what's happening, and then creation of shocks when it goes too bunched, essentially, and then why we do wing sweep. So next week we'll talk about laminar versus turbulent flow, and basically a little bit more into what happens when lift goes too far. So spoiler alert, you stall. So it's a little bit along the same lines. When lift goes too far, we end up with separated flow. We talked about that today instead of the laminar flow that we like. And we'll loop back and talk a little bit more about how that applied to wave drag, because we weren't able to do that too in depth today. And I hope to see you all next time, and enjoy staying at home. I am. I have my guitar. I'm not very good at it, but it keeps me company. All right. Thanks for coming, guys. See you next week.